I don't think there's anything Daniel Ricciardo can do at this point, my friend. This might be it. But before you say anything about him being washed, I don't think it's got anything to do with a lack of pace. And if what Christian Horner said is accurate, then Red Bull let the world dunk on Checo for no reason. From the looks of things over at Red Bull and VCarb, there is little that the Australian can do seemingly to maintain his place in F1 for 2025 and beyond. His last chance for a potential opportunity of getting back into Red Bull racing came at the Belgian Grand Prix when he and Max were expecting to be working together once more. And then a couple of days later at the supposed secret meeting, the rhetoric changed completely, but that closed the door on a return to the senior operation for Daniel, and now even the junior operation is becoming unlikely for next year. And that's down to the rookies this year, as well as Liam Lawson being able to showcase their talents and reminding people that, oh yeah, young people can drive an F1 car too. I don't think you need me to tell you that the last couple of years have been really difficult for rookies to be able to showcase their talents in Formula 1 without the world judging them after just a few races when they barely had a chance to get used to the car before we even get to Europe. 2024 being the first year where no young blood flows through the sport in Bahrain, and a cynical overview was starting to manifest that F1 didn't care about rookies and instead preferred teams to retain drivers who had a particular aura and following. You know, to keep the fans interested and engaged with the sport because there was a familiar face and, oh, they said a funny thing, and oh, we know that guy, he's got a big fan base, he brings in a lot of money, and a young person, unproven, no! Seriously, risk aversion and a fear of new things, it's really becoming a problem throughout the world. No one's wanting to take risks on new things. We keep getting sequels, we keep getting drivers that probably should have retired a couple of years earlier. It's really become a problem, hasn't it? And I think Red Bull have been the biggest examples of this, with Christian Horner, instead of wanting to buck the trend and go rebellious, sticking to what he already knows with Checo and Ricciardo. Not to mention both teams under the Red Bull umbrella are struggling in their own way, and something needs to be done. And we all thought that Sergio Perez would be the major casualty in all this, that his underperforming would lead to his contract extension to 2026 being cut short. However, things have gotten really complicated and have changed completely thanks to what Christian Horner said to Automotor und Sport. It turns out that Checo, and therefore by proxy Toto, were right. The car indeed was messed up, and might have been since the beginning of the ground effect era and really came to light last year in Spain. But the team seemingly ignored it given that Verstappen was still winning and won that Spanish Grand Prix, and the competition were floundering relatively speaking, Aston Martin being the only credible challenger at the time. And this comes from Christian Horner of all people. This isn't Helmut Marko or a random insider or a media pundit, no. This came from the chops of the team principal himself, realising that, we made an oopsie. So here's what he said. We traced the development history back, and it turned out that the first mistake we made was with an underbody upgrade in 2023 in Barcelona. That was also the Grand Prix from which Checo started having problems with the car. We just didn't take it so seriously because Max kept winning. In Baku, Max wore out the tyres much faster in traffic than Checo. Now that is quite curious, my friend, isn't it? Because when you look back to when those upgrades were implemented on the RB19, Red Bull admitted that the tweak was in response to what their rivals were doing. Now, whilst this was a shrewd decision to be paying attention to the competition, this act of looking outward instead of refining what was already working with both drivers probably might have been the thing that threw Sergio Perez off in particular. And as per Horner's own admission, Checo's words were not heeded, because Max was at the beginning of what would become a 10-race winning streak. Basically, Red Bull dragged Perez through the mud and allowed Helmut Marko to blast him to pieces metaphorically, just so Max could keep a specification that worked for him and allowed him to basically win the constructors for them without Checo's help. And if you really want to get cynical about it, considering all of the brouhaha and drama that's happening with the Verstappen camp, the drama between Jos Verstappen and Christian Horner in particular, I think them changing the specification to suit Checo and to the detriment of Max would not go down well, so you gotta keep the peace. So Max is winning, let him win, don't worry about Checo. So out of just sheer arrogance and outright panic and paranoia, Perez's reputation was torn to shreds and the world eviscerated him. This is something we really need to take into account here. It turns out now that Checo might have been trying to drive on one leg and one arm tied behind his back because he didn't have the car. Yes, people might argue that he should try and adapt to things, but the solution was right there. He told them that what was wrong, and they just ignored him. And allowing it to manifest even more so this year has potentially cost Red Bull the constructors. It's not Checo's fault, seemingly. Now that we have heard this factoid, whilst this is Red Bull being honest, it does show a degree of arrogance which has now come back to bite them hard, as them not only finding out about this now has meant that one driver has been dealing with a suboptimal car for the longest time and unable to do anything about it, it's also meant that it's come to the detriment of Max when they've discovered it and seemingly wanting to fix it. It's either meant that Checo's caught up to Max, or Max has fallen back to Checo's level, as he was not enjoying this specification of car around Baku. Now, I could go on and on and on about this, in how Checo has been vindicated and Red Bull have lost the constructors due to their own just stubbornness and believing that this wasn't a problem, but that's not the main point of this video. The main point of this video is that due to this revelation coming out into the public eye, and this actually almost absolving Checo of any responsibility, or at least most of it, it means that that avenue towards Red Bull Racing, the main goal as to why Daniel Ricciardo came back to the Red Bull fold after McLaren dropped him, that's no longer there anymore. That 2026 contract extension looks solid, at least more solid than it has been for the last several months. Christian Horner's now taken responsibility for this oversight to justify maintaining the status quo, and that what we saw in Baku has highlighted that Perez can still compete when the car is working for him. In fact, had he not gotten into a tangle with Carlos, he might have finished second behind Piastri. It means that potentially, the Mexican Minister of Defense might have been there the whole time, he just didn't have the right tools, and Toto is probably feeling smug right now. You see, I told you, I had the printout, I had the email right there. So yeah, things aren't looking good for Daniel, but wait, there's more bad news for him. Even if Daniel wanted to try and justify his place on the grid next year, over at VCarb, things are really not looking good. He and Yuki just simply don't have the car to do anything. The car's been off the boil for the last few races. Both drivers have been complaining almost every single race that not only do the upgrades that VCarb bring not work at all, unlike what they were able to do at the beginning of the year, but the team has been producing subpar strategies which have hindered them getting anywhere near the top 10. Both of them. It's not just Daniel complaining, he's trying to be diplomatic here, but it's also Yuki complaining as well. The team hasn't scored at all since F1 returned from the summer break, the last point coming in Spa from Daniel Ricciardo himself. Contrast that to their rivals, and they're chipping away at the team's 6th place in the constructors. In fact, you could easily argue that Williams is doing more than just chipping away at the problem. Alex Albon's not chipping away at the problem, he's sledgehammering the problem, because he's now scored 2 races in a row, and Colapinto scored his first points in Formula 1, as is evidenced by my bet. Williams are now back in the room, with Haas regrouping as well, albeit slightly. With neither Ricciardo or Tsunoda able to respond in a meaningful way, there are plenty of reasons to look for a drastic change in which to acquire points or to refresh the team's morale. And that could be at the expense of the elder of their drivers, since Tsunoda's already locked in for next year. Then there's the biggest hammer blow in the room. Considering that Tsunoda is indeed contracted for next year, Helmut Marko has now come out on the record, and trust me, when it comes to Lawson, he is the one in the know here, since he has got something to do with the junior team, that a decision will be made regarding the second driver at VCarb between Singapore and Austin. That's a big window, though. That's about 4 weeks, and yeah, we're about to go into a 1-month drought, my friend. This is yet another summer break after we've just had a summer break. This is mad. The calendar this year is just so topsy-turvy and badly distributed, seriously. They will decide whether they keep Daniel or they put their faith in Liam, and after all, the team need to do something to get positive headlines, since the branding of the team doesn't really yield much in terms of character, personality, loyalty, aside from the drivers' personalities themselves. Put simply, the team is incapable of doing anything to generate good press, and it's starting to really affect their morale. There's nothing that Daniel and Yuki can do. So even if Daniel is finding his groove with the car, if it gets him 11th and 12th, sure, that might be good for him in that he's not right at the back, but it's still no points. And Yuki? It's not that much different. After all of the promise and potential, the 7th places, the 8th places at the beginning of the season, them actually showing up VCarb, Aston Martin of all teams, this is a major climb down, whereas Aston Martin, they're now on the ascendancy again. The teams drop the ball when it comes to strategy and just being an F1 team. It's really compromised them. And speaking of that, since their upgrades began in earnest, it's Daniel who has finished ahead of Yuki more often. Since the Canadian Grand Prix, that's 9 races ago as of Baku, Ricciardo has finished ahead of Tsunoda 7 times to 2. Yes, DNFs have come into play for both drivers, but Ricciardo hasn't exactly fallen off a cliff as the season progressed. And yes, I know that you're going to be saying that this is still not what we expect from Daniel Ricciardo. People were expecting him to wipe the floor with Yuki Tsunoda, and you're right, absolutely. He has not been able to do that. But still, when it comes to race results, even if it's not for points, the bragging rights as to beating your teammate, Daniel has been more successful in the second half of the season so far, or at least in the middle third. But no matter which way you try to spin it, the team is down the dumps. They've not been able to have any Q3 cameos, which were a nice surprise, and I think that's really going to count against them because Yuki doesn't really have to worry so much because he's got a guaranteed seat for next year, whereas Daniel, he's fighting for his life here. But I think the team's gotten exactly what they want out of Daniel because they've got all the big name sponsors now because Ricciardo was originally on the ticket. The team might be justified to look at their New Zealand saviour from 2023 for some freshness, and also because they don't want to lose him due to contract things. And given that Perez seems to be safe now for a couple of years, the team has to use Lawson, or else he might have to join the bloodbath that is the second seat at Sauber. Because now there are reports that Franco Colapinto might be in line for that Sauber seat because James Vowles has said he's going to do everything in his power to get him that seat next to Nico Hülkenberg. And given that Bortoleto has the backing of many Brazilian companies, as well as McLaren, one of the best teams out there at the moment, and two-time champion Fernando Alonso, it's going to be an absolute mess when it comes to contract negotiations. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to cover that in a future video, and when that does drop, be sure to subscribe so that means you get it first. That being said, Colapinto and Behrman have given me a really interesting thought. I don't need the foam of doubt for this one because I think it's actually quite logical. What these two kiddos have shown the world is that rookies can get results in F1, and they're trendy again. So why would Red Bull get rid of Liam Lawson? They've got a rookie themselves. Yeah, neither Behrman or Colapinto are in contention for titles in F2 presently, especially the former, but there is something about them which seems to work well with an F1 car. The opposite can be said for drivers as well. Sometimes cars in the junior formulae work better for them than Formula 1 cars. Case in point, Logan Sargent. Back in F3, he was going toe-to-toe with Oscar Piastri. Piastri was really sad to lose Logan Sargent from the F1 grid because he saw firsthand how good he was. It's just a case of F1 wasn't for Logan. It just seemingly didn't gel well, and it really didn't help that Williams car was a tricky one to drive. Even Alex Albon was finding it tricky due to the fact that it really didn't like going up against crosswinds and stuff like that. And also, in the last few years, we've seen so many rookies fall at the first hurdle and really make big headlines for all the wrong reasons. Case in point, Nikita Mazepin, Nicholas Latifi, and yes, Mick Schumacher, with his struggles it has, I will admit, and of course Logan Sargent. This attention has manifested a very small window of tolerance for newcomers amongst new fans. If they don't perform within a few races, calls for their removal start to bubble up online, and then it grows from there. It's really depressing to see unfold. However, I am so glad that Oliver Behrman, Franco Colapinto, they've really been able to show their stuff. Gabriel Bortoleto in F2 and his consistency in a season of F2, which has seen so many drivers go up and down in the standings, is absolutely nuts. Bortoleto and Hadjar are the only two constants, seemingly, in terms of the driver standings. That's why they're fighting for the title. So because of that, and the F1 rookie stepping in as substitute, this has really shown that, hey, young drivers can be good and they can also endear themselves. It's only been a couple of weeks and Franco Colapinto, he was a relative unknown, the guy who took Logan's seat, and now people are going, no Franco, don't go! It's a really major turnaround and I am all for it because next year it's gonna be so good. We could have 4 or 5 rookies in Formula 1 next year. That's the most we've seen since 2019. It's been 6 years since we've had these many new talents come into the fray, and I'm all for it. And to top it all off, Liam Lawson has been really busy in the background, bigging up his fan base to make his comeback to F1 all the more justified. And Red Bull, they simply got no choice. They're over a barrel here, which means that there is little that Daniel Ricciardo can do to justify him being kept around. It's not as simple as calling him washed or old either. It's really a complex situation. Because yes, as I touched upon earlier, he has been able to finish ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, even though it wasn't for points, so points mean prizes in F1, so ultimately that is a meaningless factor. But also, Daniel Ricciardo is a really good welcoming presence within the team. As I said on the Red Flags podcast, in terms of a dream team lineup, yeah, I could ask for 2 really fast drivers and go from there, and then Bob's your uncle. You want a driver who is not only quite talented, but also a person who has a strong work ethic, as well as a belief that he can big up the spirit of a team. Look what Daniel Ricciardo was able to do in his 2 years with Renault, bigging up the team. Him going, they completely fell apart and just descended into chaos. I think if he weren't around, AlphaTauri's spirits would have been torn to shreds. They would have really been low on morale, and yes, he's not in his prime anymore, but I think he had his place there. But even then, I think Red Bull have plenty of reasons now to drop him, which aren't based around performance, or Daniel specifically. So what does he do now? Does he potentially leave motorsport entirely? Does he go to another racing series that is completely different to Formula One? Does he become a full-time entrepreneur, since he's now got his clothes line, he's got his range of alcoholic beverages, so he can keep himself busy and stuff like that. He can appear on American talk shows, he could become a talking head for Drive to Survive since they absolutely adore him. The possibilities are endless for him. He's been so calculated in being a driver of the people. People like him. Even if you don't like him as a driver, you've got to admit, he is an interesting person. He is a character. But I think he will be in motorsport, and he has given a very big clue as to what he might like to do next, and this is something I've been thinking for the longest time. It just makes so much sense. As you might have noticed, the trend amongst most F2 drivers who can't get into F1, and even now Bottas is considering it, now his career's on the ropes, is to simply go up to an IndyCar operation and go, "Here's a job, mate, I'm an F1 driver." I don't think that's what Daniel has in mind, because you've really got to look at the bigger picture. Consider why Daniel Ricciardo's number is the number 3. Consider why one of his goals in life and one of the requests that he had with Zach Brown was to drive a classic Dale Earnhardt NASCAR from the 80s. He absolutely loves Dale Earnhardt and NASCAR and Americana. Have you noticed that any single opportunity Daniel can dress up as a cowboy, he goes to the absolute maximum. He dresses up to the nines. He drapes himself in almost anything that has a Star-Spangled Banner on it. Cowboy hat, the leathers, the jeans, the cowboy boots. He absolutely loves it. He has embraced America into his own psyche. That all culminating in Austin of 2021 when he got to drive Dale Earnhardt's 1984 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. Sorry, I got that in my brain after that really sad final Grand Tour. And my thoughts are further emboldened because he's dropped a big hint that he would like to try out NASCAR after his F1 career is done, and that he'd love to race around Daytona International Speedway to boot. Oh, thank you, Daniel. I've been waiting for someone to talk about Daytona, because now it gives me an opportunity to just shout out at the top of my lungs, Daytona! Let's go away. Oh, I love that game. Admittedly, Ricciardo isn't sure whether or not he would want to compete on a regular basis, but he's still loving to give it a go and see how he would handle it, and I can easily see him fitting into that world like a glove. Can you imagine Ricky Bobby with a handlebar moustache, draped in leathers, just walking up to a NASCAR event and go, "Right, fellas, let's do some NASCAR, right?" And he just fit in. It just works. It's natural. Plenty of F1 drivers have done it in the past. Look what JB was doing last year at Le Mans in that NASCAR, the Hendrick one, going around Le Mans with those tiny little prototype cars, and then the NASCAR going, "No!" Netflix won't care where he goes, because the full-speed documentary, the analytics for that will go through the roof if Daniel becomes a regular driver there. So, yes, the purpose of this video is not to say that Daniel Ricciardo sucks and Red Bull should be sacking him because he's not good enough. There is more to it than that. There are so many other factors in play here that just makes it impossible for you to say Daniel's washed, get rid of him. The fact of the matter is that rookies are now trendy. They're popular again in F1. Thank you. And it means that Liam Lawson absolutely has to be picked for that second V-carb seat, or else they're going to lose him. They're going to lose him to another team, and Red Bull will be off of the game. They'll be out of sequence to every other team, which is now really starting to back rookies. Colapinto, Behrman, Lawson, Bortoletto, Antonelli. They're really starting to show that these guys do have what it takes, even though F2 is slowly becoming more and more irrelevant, and most of the drivers there aren't good enough for F1, save for maybe 4, 5, 6 of them, including Franco, surprisingly, but also a welcome one. But I don't think this means that Red Bull will abandon him entirely, because most of the time, if a Red Bull driver retires with them, they are still attached to them for the longest time, including DC, Weber. They do demo runs for them in other F1 cars. And if Ricciardo does enter NASCAR, they could easily sponsor him. They did just that a few days ago with their new signing, Connor Zilic. So perhaps this is them getting their brand back into the sport, ready for a Ricciardo debut. Interesting. I'm glad that Daniel does have plans for motorsport in the future, and I'm glad that Checo has been vindicated in that, yes, there was something wrong with the Red Bull car, and now we should really take that matter into account, that it wasn't entirely his fault as to why he just went off the boil. The team just ignored him and were just taking his money, and they didn't care last year that he was really floundering. They allowed him to be thrown to the lions in terms of the press, because Max was doing all the work for them. Didn't matter. But in regards to F1, I do think this is it, because there's just no more room at the inn for Daniel. But I think he has accepted this. He's now bigging up Yuki Tsunoda wherever he can. He should have a chance at Red Bull. It just seems like that's just the way things are. But I think that Australia will continue to advance, with the Doohan name gracing the stage for the first time in F1, as well as their chances of championship glory still being around with Oscar Piastri, and how he could be the one to be Verstappen's ultimate rival. And to find out why I think this, and why I think Oscar Piastri has what it takes to go up against Max in the championship campaign, as well as potentially maybe Leclerc and Lando Norris, go and watch this video next, because I am so pleased that people are starting to recognise and take his name seriously.